What was the world Jesus of Nazareth walked in truly like? For nearly 2,000 years, our imagination has been shaped by Renaissance artists, cathedral-stained glass, and, more recently, Hollywood blockbusters. In these representations, the setting is almost always idyllic, clean, and serene. We see disciples wearing tunics of impeccable white linen, walking along dry roads under a golden sunset. We see clean faces, perfectly trimmed beards, and a sense of asepsis that makes us believe that life in first-century Judea was simple, calm, and purified. But what if I invited you to step outside this cinematic frame? Brutal hygiene, 2,000 years ago. The dark side in the time of Jesus. If you could be transported right now to a street in Capernaum or the slopes of Jerusalem during a sacred festival, your first instinct would not be one of reverence, but of absolute shock. The historical reality, revealed by archaeology and the meticulous study of ancient records, tells a very different story. A story that is not made of white linen, but of accumulated sweat, suffocating dust, and a brutal struggle for biological survival. To understand the man from Galilee and the message he preached, one must first understand the body he inhabited and the visceral environment where he lived. We are about to descend to ground level, where hygiene was not an aesthetic choice, but a thin line between life and death. Stay with me until the end, because what we are going to discover here goes far beyond historical curiosity. It is a strengthening of our understanding of what it meant to live in that era. It is understanding how divine purity chose to walk in a world of brutal impurity. Prepare to catch your breath, because this is the dark and hidden side of the time of Jesus. The first impact for someone entering a time machine headed for the first century would not come through the eyes, but through the nose. Before you even noticed the architecture of the stone houses or the bustle of the markets, you would be hit by what historians call the great olfactory wall of the ancient world. Imagine the thick air of a modern city in the middle of a months-long trash strike under a scorching sun of 40 degrees Celsius. Now, multiply that by the total absence of sewage systems, waste collection, or basic sanitation. In the villages of Galilee, the smell was a pungent, heavy, and absolutely inescapable mixture. There was the constant odor of wood smoke and dried dung burned in domestic braziers for cooking. That smoke irritated the eyes, darkened the walls, and permeated clothing until it became part of the very scent of each resident's skin. There was the smell of live animals, goats, sheep, and donkeys that not only roamed the narrow streets but often shared the same roof as families. Imagine the body heat of these animals serving as heating on cold nights. But the price for this was air heavy with ammonia, urine, and stable odors inside the home itself. But there was something deeper and more disturbing. In the world of Jesus, organic waste, both animal and human, was frequently discarded in open ditches or piled in specific corners of the streets. Where there was a fish market, such as in Capernaum on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, the odor of entrails and scales rotting under the sun made the air almost solid, a mass of smells that attracted infinite swarms of flies. The smell was not just an environmental detail, it was a social and professional identity. Every person carried the scent of their trade with them. The leather tanner smelled of urine and excrement used in treating hides. The fisherman smelled of dead fish and brine. The peasant smelled of damp earth and weeks of accumulated sweat. In the first century, the smell of people was a mixture of rancid body oils and volcanic dust. You knew who a man was and what his social class was before he even opened his mouth. It was enough for him to pass by your side. When we look at the ground where Jesus stepped, we find the second great pillar of this brutality, the omnipresence of dust. Judea and Galilee are lands of geological contrasts, but the common denominator is dust. In the summer, the basalt and limestone soil disintegrates into a fine, corrosive flour. Every step taken by a rustic leather sandal kicked up a cloud of particles that instantly settled on skin damp with sweat. This dust was not merely superficial. It seeped into pores, caused chronic eye inflammations that led many to partial blindness, and created a crust on the feet that was nearly impossible to remove without dedicated effort. This is why, in the Gospels, the act of washing feet was not just a gesture of symbolic humility or a religious ritual. It was a physical necessity of extreme urgency and a relief from pain. To enter a house with feet covered in the dirt of the road was to bring into the sacred environment of the family a dangerous mixture of road dust and organic waste from the streets. Washing the feet was the watershed that separated the brutality of the outside world from the sanctuary of the home. But why didn't people wash more often? The answer is simple and cruel: the tyranny of water. Today, we turn on a faucet and have running, treated, infinite water. 2,000 years ago, water was a resource paid for with the price of sweat and extreme physical exhaustion. Sources of fresh water were rare and precious. In tiny Nazareth, for example, archaeology suggests there was only one main spring for the entire village. Imagine the logistics of an ordinary peasant family. It was the women who, at dawn, carried heavy ceramic jars on their heads or shoulders, walking hundreds of meters, sometimes kilometers, to fetch the day's basic supply. A full jar could weigh 20 kilograms or more. With such monumental effort, water could not be wasted on luxuries like immersion baths or frequent washing of tunics. Water was reserved for the essentials: drinking and cooking. Body cleaning was done in a punctual and strategic manner. Human skin rarely knew the sensation of being completely free of residue for more than a few hours. Soap, as we know it today, simply did not exist for the common people of Galilee. What they used to try to remove grease and heavier dirt were ashes mixed with cheap oils or rustic stones to scrape the skin. It was an abrasive process, often painful and inefficient by modern standards. In this setting of suffocating dust and water scarcity, personal hygiene was a losing battle against the invisible. Without knowledge of germ theory, the common man saw dirt as a physical burden, a sensory nuisance, but rarely as a direct biological risk. Skin infections, wounds that became chronic due to lack of cleaning, and parasitic plagues were accepted as the normal state of human existence. Understanding this environment is fundamental to understanding the figure of Jesus in a more human and powerful way. When we read about him touching a leper or allowing a woman with a discharge of blood to touch him, we are not just reading about a breach of a religious rule. We are reading about someone who reached out to what was most visceral, dirty, and rejected in a society living on the edge of physical endurance and environmental impurity. Jesus did not teach in a sterilized classroom or a recording studio. He taught in the midst of dust, the strong odor of animals, and the raw reality of human flesh suffering from a lack of cleanliness. If the streets were battlefields, what happened inside the walls of the houses? How did families manage their own bodies and waste in such small spaces without privacy and without bathrooms? In the next block, we will cross the threshold of the door and discover the secrets of domestic hygiene, what truly replaced soap, how they dealt with physiological needs, and the surprising difference between what was considered dirty for the body and what was impure for the soul. The sanctuary of filth and the enigma of soap. As we cross the threshold of a typical house in first-century Galilee, the concept of home sweet home takes on a connotation that would challenge all our modern senses. If the streets were an olfactory battlefield, the interior of the residences was the headquarters of a forced coexistence with what we would today call unsanitary conditions. As we saw previously, houses were single spaces, without internal divisions or hallways, and it is here, within these four walls of stone and mud, that personal and domestic hygiene revealed its most brutal and ingenious face. The first detail we must face is the floor. As you saw in the text about the houses, the ground was packed earth, mixed with straw and lime. But there is a detail rarely mentioned. This floor was an organic sponge. Without tiles or waterproof surfaces, any spilled liquid, be it cooking water, milk, or biological waste, was absorbed by the earth. Daily cleaning did not consist of using a damp cloth or disinfectant, but of sweeping the surface layer of dust and debris with brooms made of dry branches. The result was an environment where fine dust was constantly suspended, settling on exposed food and the skin of the residents. But the true brutality of domestic hygiene lay in the presence of animals. In the humblest houses, the step down in the floor served to house a goat, a few sheep, or a donkey during the night. Imagine the scene: a family of 6 or 7 people sleeping on straw mats just a few meters from animals that urinated and defecated right there during the 12 hours of darkness. Animal heat was vital for survival in winter. but the cost was a saturation of ammonia gases and stable odors that never left the environment. For the inhabitant of that time, the smell of animal urine was the smell of thermal comfort. It was a cruel trade-off between not freezing to death and breathing deeply contaminated air. Where was the bathroom? This is the question most viewers ask, but the answer is one of the darkest in biblical archaeology. In the towns and villages of Jesus' time, the concept of a private bathroom or washroom simply did not exist for common people. In large cities like Jerusalem, the Roman and Jewish elites had latrine systems, but for the Galilean peasant, the management of human waste was an exercise in improvisation and exposure. During the day, people used open areas on the outskirts of villages or communal ditches. At night, the use of ceramic vessels inside the house was the only option. These vessels were emptied in the morning, often being dumped directly into the narrow streets or onto piles of organic fertilizer near the houses. There was no toilet paper. In its place, smooth pebbles, handfuls of dry herbs, or in the case of the poorest, the left hand itself were used, which then became permanently considered unclean for handling food or for social greetings. This practice deeply shaped Middle Eastern customs, creating a physical and cultural distinction between the hand of cleaning and the hand of eating. But if the environment was so hostile, how did people wash their own bodies? Here we enter the enigma of soap. Bar soap, sudsy and scented, was a non-existent technology in rural Judea. To remove the crust of sweat and volcanic dust that accumulated on the skin, the secret was not water, but oil. Olive oil, the same used for food and lighting, was the primary cleaning agent. The process was almost ritualistic, and to us, would seem paradoxical. To get clean, you covered yourself in grease. The oil was rubbed vigorously into the skin to dissolve the dirt. Then, an instrument called a strigil was used, a kind of curved metal or wooden scraper to squeegee the mixture of rancid oil, sweat, and dirt off the body. What remained was shiny skin, but still impregnated with the strong odor of oil and basal perspiration. For the poorest, who could not waste precious oil, the substitute was fine sand or wood ashes mixed with a little water, creating an abrasive paste that literally sanded the dirt off the skin, often causing micro-fissures and irritations that paved the way for infections. Oral hygiene was another monumental challenge. Without bristle brushes or toothpaste, tooth health depended on rustic methods. Chewing branches of certain plants with antiseptic properties, such as the arak bush, or rubbing the teeth with coarse fabrics and sea salt, was the most that could be done. The result was a population that, by 30 years of age, already showed severe wear and tooth loss, making the act of eating a painful task for many. Chronic bad breath was the norm, not the exception, and this was accepted as a natural part of human interaction. And what about clothes? In the time of Jesus, most people owned only 2 changes of clothes, a short tunic for work and a heavier cloak for the cold and to serve as a blanket at night. Washing these garments was a Herculean task that happened only a few times a year, usually at major festivals or the changing of the seasons. Clothes were beaten against stones in streams or water sources, and the detergent of the time was lye, obtained by filtering wood ashes. This chemical process was corrosive to women's hands and fabric fibers, but it was the only way to remove deep grease and odors. However, there was an obsession that surpassed physical cleanliness: ritual purity. For the first-century Jew, being clean was a theological matter. Purity laws required frequent washing of hands before meals and ritual immersions in tanks called mikvaot after contact with anything considered impure, such as a corpse or certain body fluids. The paradox was glaring. A man could plunge into a mikvah to become ritually pure before God, but the water in that tank, shared by hundreds of people and rarely changed, could be biologically contaminated with bacteria and parasites. They sought spiritual holiness while their bodies fought against the reality of an environment saturated with pathogens. Jesus lived and preached exactly in this setting of contrasts. When he said that, "It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a man, but what comes out of it," he was challenging a society that spent immense energy trying to maintain ritual asepsis in the midst of physical hygienic brutality. He saw the calloused hands, the mud-encrusted feet, and the honest sweat of the worker not as filth, but as the mark of humanity. If the body and the house were already stages for an invisible struggle, there was an even more persistent and cruel enemy that gave no rest, even during sleep. In the next block, we will explore the dark side, disease, and insects. We will discover how lice, fleas, and intestinal parasites were the true silent rulers of the ancient world, and how this constant infestation shaped the behavior, health, and even the life expectancy of the people surrounding the Messiah. The dark side, the invisible rulers of the body. If you thought the smell of the streets and the rancid oil on the skin were the limit of human endurance, prepare to enter the deepest and most disturbing layer of life in the 1st century. For the inhabitant of Galilee, the human body was not private and isolated property. It was an ecosystem, a territory colonized by a legion of invaders that gave no truce for even a single second. We are talking about the invisible rulers of the ancient world, parasites and insects. In the comfort of the modern world, we treat lice, fleas, and bedbugs as isolated incidents or signs of extreme neglect. But, in the time of Jesus, these beings were as omnipresent as the very air one breathed. Imagine trying to listen to a sermon on a hillside or resting after an exhaustive day of work in the field, while dozens of insects crawled under your thick wool tunic. Wool, the most common fabric of the time, was the perfect habitat for these visitors. It retained heat, moisture from sweat, and offered thousands of hiding places among its rustic fibers. Modern archaeology has given us irrefutable proof of this brutal reality. In excavations at sites like Masada and in the caves of the Dead Sea, wooden and bone combs were found with teeth so fine and close together that they leave no doubt. Their primary function was not aesthetic, but rather the mechanical and desperate removal of nits and lice. Studies of biological remains from that era reveal that nearly 100% of the population lived with chronic infestations. The act of scratching in public was not a sign of bad manners. It was a reflex of survival. Lice did not just inhabit heads. They lived in the seams of clothes, jumping from person to person in every hug, every handshake, and every prayer made side by side in the synagogues. The silent companions of sleep. But the true horror began when the sun went down. As we saw earlier, families slept together on straw mats or wool rugs, often in direct contact with the dirt floor. This setting was paradise for bedbugs and fleas. In the silence of the night, as the fire in the brazier went out, these insects emerged from the cracks in the stone walls and the fibers of the mats to feed. Sleep, which should have been a moment of restoration, was frequently interrupted by incessant bites that caused skin inflammation, pustules, and constant nervous irritation. For a child growing up in Nazareth, the sensation of having insects crawling over their face during the night was not a nightmare. It was the reality of every night, and there was nowhere to run. There were no insecticides, no screens on the windows, and no way to isolate the bed. Brutal hygiene meant accepting that you would never truly be alone in your own body. This constant infestation had consequences that went far beyond discomfort. The chronic blood loss, caused by thousands of bites over months, added to a diet often poor in iron, contributed to a generalized anemia in the population, diminishing energy and resistance against more serious diseases. However, external enemies were only half the story. The real danger lived inside the gut. Due to the lack of sanitation we explored in the previous block and the use of contaminated water, intestinal parasites were an absolute plague. Worms, such as roundworms and tapeworms, were life companions for almost every peasant. The lack of the habit of washing hands with soap before handling bread meant that the eggs of these parasites were ingested daily in an endless cycle of reinfestation. Imagine the impact of this on a child's development. These parasites robbed essential nutrients from bodies already struggling with food scarcity. The result was a devastating infant mortality rate. Historians estimate that about 50% of children did not reach the age of 10 in the 1st century. Many of them wasted away due to gastrointestinal infections that today would be resolved with a simple glass of clean water and basic hygiene. The plague of the eyes. And if we descend to the most intimate details of the human face, we find another face of this brutality: eye diseases. In the world of Jesus, blindness was not just a theme for miracles, it was a public health epidemic. The combination of constant dust, lack of facial cleansing, and above all, the massive presence of flies created the perfect scenario for trachoma. Flies, attracted by the natural secretions of the eyes, carried bacteria from animal waste directly to people's eyelids. Without antibiotics or eye drops, a simple eye infection evolved into scars on the cornea, and eventually, total darkness. When the Gospels narrate Jesus meeting various blind people along the way, they are describing a human landscape where red, inflamed, and purulent eyes were common on every village corner. Blindness was the final destiny for many workers who, after decades of exposure to the dust of carpentry or the field, lost their sight to what they called the evil of the desert. This entire biological load created an environment of chronic fatigue and latent pain. The common man of Jesus' time lived in a state of permanent sensory alert against what bit him, what consumed him from within, and what blinded him from without. The resilience of these people was heroic, but the price was a life expectancy that rarely exceeded 40 years for the lower classes. It is in this context of suffering and infested bodies that Jesus' message gains overwhelming strength. When he spoke about rest for the weary, he was not just talking about existential or spiritual weariness. He was speaking to people whose bodies were exhausted from the fight against parasites, the pain of skin infections, and the constant irritation of a world that was never clean. His healings were not just demonstrations of divine power. They were acts of biological restoration in a world that had given up on physical health. Jesus touched those whom no one else wanted to touch. He placed his hands over eyes that were covered with flies and infection. He embraced those whose tunics were infested with plagues. In doing so, he broke the greatest barrier of the time, the fear of contamination. In the ancient world, disease and extreme filth were seen as a mark of divine disfavor or an unbearable social risk. Jesus, by entering this dark side of the human condition, was saying that no body is too dirty for the presence of God. But the question remains, how did the cleaning tools of the time try to combat this tide of filth? What were the 4 essential objects that made up the hygienic survival kit of a Galilean family? In the next block, we will detail the actual utensils found by archaeology and discover how salt, oil, and even tree branches were the only weapons available against the brutality of the time. The survival kit, weapons against filth. Faced with a world that seemed to conspire against the integrity of the human body, survival required ingenuity. If there were no pharmacies, filtration systems, or chemicals, how did a family in Galilee try to maintain a minimum of dignity and health? The answer lies in 4 fundamental objects. 4 elements that made up the hygienic survival kit of almost every household, from the humblest fisherman's dwelling to the residence of a master of the law. To understand these objects is to understand the care routine that Jesus observed and practiced throughout his earthly life. The first object, and perhaps the most ubiquitous, was the ceramic water jar and clay basin. As we saw, water was a scarce resource, but its use was governed by rigorous discipline. At the entrance of every house, or in a strategic corner of the main room, these 2 items awaited the visitor. The washing of hands and feet was not an act of fastidiousness. It was a primitive sanitary barrier. But there is a detail that history rarely emphasizes. The clay basin was a dangerous point of sharing. Often, the entire family used the same water from the basin to rinse their hands before touching the communal bread. Without knowing it, that cleaning object could become a vehicle for cross-contamination. Porous ceramic, while functional, accumulated bacteria in its microscopic cracks that no simple washing could remove. It was a delicate balance between the desire to be clean and the technical reality of the time. The second element of the kit was olive oil, stored in small clay ampules or rustic glass. As we have already mentioned, oil was the substitute for soap, but its function went far beyond just dissolving dirt. Olive oil was the protective shield of the skin against the aggressions of the desert climate. In a world where the sun and the dry Judean wind could crack the skin until it caused bleeding, oil served as a sealing layer. People anointed themselves not only for religious reasons, but out of dermatological necessity. The oil prevented moisture loss and helped heal the small abrasions caused by abrasive dust. When Jesus mentioned that, when fasting, a man should anoint his head and wash his face, he was describing the basic routine of a person taking care of their appearance amidst the brutality of the environment. Oil was the shine that hid the fatigue and harshness of life. The third object was the most surprising and multi-purpose of all: coarse salt. Today, we see salt only as a seasoning, but 2,000 years ago, it was humanity's primary disinfectant. Salt was used in ways that would seem brutal to us today. Newborns were rubbed with salt shortly after birth. It was believed that this hardened the skin and prevented infections, a practice cited even in the prophecies of Ezekiel. Salt was the only real defense against rot. It was rubbed into meats for preservation, but it was also used in oral hygiene and the treatment of open wounds. Imagine the suffering of a worker who, after an accidental cut, had coarse salt pressed against raw flesh to prevent gangrene from setting in. Salt stung, but it saved lives. It was the symbol of preservation in a world that tended toward rapid decomposition. Finally, the fourth element of the kit was the arak branch, or palm fibers. This was the ancestor of our toothbrush. People cut small branches from specific trees, such as the Salvadora persica, and chewed one end until the fibers separated, forming a kind of rustic brush. These fibers contained natural oils and antiseptic substances that helped combat bacterial plaque and bad breath. Those who did not have access to these branches used pieces of linen cloth or simply rubbed their teeth with a finger dipped in salt or fine ashes. Oral hygiene was a constant struggle against toothache, which was one of the most feared afflictions of antiquity. Without dentists, a deep cavity was a sentence of suffering that could last for months until the tooth fell out or the infection spread. The discipline of survival. These four objects, the water jar, the oil, the salt, and the chewed branch, formed the front line of an invisible war. They required a daily discipline that consumed time and energy. Nothing was automatic. Behind every small act of cleaning, there was an exhaustive manual process. The man of Galilee lived in a state of constant maintenance of himself. And this is where we begin to perceive a profound truth. This extreme simplicity was not just a lack of resources. It was a principle of life that shaped people's character. They knew that essentials fit into a small space and that negligence with any one of them could lead to disaster. A broken jar, a running out of oil or salt that lost its flavor were real domestic tragedies. Jesus grew up observing this meticulous management of the little they had. He saw his mother, Mary, organizing these utensils, ensuring that salt was never lacking and that oil was used with wisdom. He understood that physical cleaning was a constant, heroic effort. However, he also noticed something that no one else seemed to notice. Even with all the oil, salt, and water in the world, the human being still felt impure. There was a sense that, no matter how much the skin was scraped with oil or the feet washed in the basin, the dirt of the world still remained impregnated in the soul. The ritualism of the time tried to solve this with increasingly complex laws, but the brutality of life remained there, visible in wounds that would not close and in bodies that aged too quickly. But was this struggle against filth the same for everyone? Did the luxury of Jerusalem offer a real alternative to this brutality, or was it just a more expensive mask for the same physical decay? In the next block, we will explore social contrast. We will leave the humble houses of Galilee and enter the Roman baths and Herod's palaces to understand the abyss that separated the rich from the poor regarding hygiene, and how this abyss influenced the most famous parables of Jesus. The social abyss and the purity of the heart. Throughout this journey, we have walked through the dust of Galilean villages and entered the suffocating intimacy of peasant houses. But to understand the totality of brutal hygiene in the time of Jesus, we must look at the other side of the wall. We must observe the abyss that separated the fisherman of Capernaum from the aristocrat of Jerusalem or the Roman official stationed in Judea. Hygiene at that time was the greatest marker of social caste. Where the poor found survival, the rich found ostentation. But as we shall see, even luxury hid dark secrets. While the peasant rationed every drop of water from a shared basin, the elites lived in a parallel reality. In Jerusalem, and in cities of Greco-Roman influence, such as Sepphoris, just a few kilometers from Nazareth, water flowed through monumental aqueducts. The rich had gardens with fountains, and most importantly, private bathrooms. Archaeology has revealed mansions in Jerusalem with their own mikvaot, ritual purification tanks, carved into solid rock and lined with high-quality plaster. For the wealthy, purification was not an exhaustive physical effort, but an architectural comfort. Roman luxury, and the illusion of cleanliness. The Romans brought the culture of public baths to the land of Israel. They were marble palaces with underground heating systems, steam rooms, and pools of cold and hot water. For a Roman official, being clean meant spending hours being massaged with scented oils brought from distant lands like Egypt and Arabia. Their tunics were washed by slaves in specialized workshops called fulonike, where the ammonia from human urine was used as an industrial bleach to ensure a white that blinded under the sun. However, even in this luxury, there was a hidden and repulsive side. The public baths, though beautiful, were cauldrons of bacteria. The water was rarely changed, and the lack of chlorine meant that parasites and skin diseases were democratically shared among all bathers. In luxury public latrines, the wealthy used the xylospongium, a sponge attached to a stick for personal cleaning. The brutal detail: this sponge was shared by all users, remaining submerged in a basin of salt water between uses. Roman luxury was often just a golden mask over a mountain of germs. Jesus was perfectly aware of this abyss. When he told the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, he drew a social portrait that his audience immediately understood through the senses. He described a rich man dressed in purple and fine linen, clothes that required constant and expensive washing. And at his gate, poor Lazarus, covered in sores that dogs came to lick. For the listener of that time, the image of Lazarus was not just one of poverty, but of absolute hygienic misery. He was the man who had no access to oil, salt, or clean water. His skin was the living record of the brutality of the ancient world. Jesus did not use these images by chance. He was denouncing a society where the appearance of external cleanliness was used to hide internal moral rot. He saw the Pharisees meticulously washing the outside of cups and plates, following infinite ritual hygiene rules, while their hearts ignored the physical misery of their brothers. To conclude this investigation, we must reflect. When we look at the brutal hygiene of 2,000 years ago, we are not just studying archaeological curiosities. We are entering the setting where the Son of God chose to live the human experience in its rawest form. Jesus did not isolate himself in a sterilized environment. He inhabited a world of strong odors, suffocating dust, and bodies marked by the struggle against parasites and diseases. Understanding this environment changes the way we read the Gospels. It reveals a Christ deeply incarnated in physical reality. He knew the weight of a water jar, the pain of an inflamed tooth, and the sting of sweat mixed with dust in the eyes. When he promised the water of life, he was speaking to people whose throats were perpetually dry and whose bodies cried out for cleansing. The greatest lesson that the hygiene of Jesus' time leaves us is that true purity never depended on Roman aqueducts or expensive oils. It was born on the dirt floor of the humble houses of Galilee through mutual care, respect for one's neighbor, and the integrity of the heart. Jesus showed that essentials fit into a small space, and that true wealth was not in the white, washed tunic, but in the hand extended to touch what the world considered dirty. Today, we live in a world of asepsis, antibiotics, and infinite comfort. But perhaps we have something to learn from those men and women of 2,000 years ago. They teach us that human dignity does not depend on the circumstances of the environment, but on the strength of our faith and the clarity of our soul. May we walk today with the awareness that the same light that illuminated the dusty houses of Galilee is still the only light capable of cleaning what truly matters, our interior. And what about you? Did you have any idea that life in the time of Jesus was so visceral and challenging for the senses? History often forgets to tell us these details that make the Bible much more real and powerful. If this documentary expanded your vision and strengthened your understanding of the historical context of the Christian faith, your support is fundamental for us to continue producing this type of content. Don't leave this video without hitting the like button. This helps YouTube understand that this content is relevant to more people who love biblical archaeology. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming documentaries. We are preparing even deeper investigations into the ancient world. And now I want to hear from you. Which of these details about ancient hygiene impressed you the most? The fact that they shared their homes with animals, or the use of oil instead of soap? Write it down here in the comments. I read every single one of you, and I love knowing the opinion of those who follow our work. Share this video in your Bible study group or with that friend who loves historical curiosities. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Your viewership is what allows us to keep alive the history that sustains our walk. Until the next documentary.